Welcome to Sustainability Now, an exploration of technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. Designed for socially conscious entrepreneurs and individuals interested in responsible stewardship of the planet. Sustainability Now covers food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome, everybody, to Sustainability Now, Technologies and Paradigms to Shape a World That Works. I'm your host, Mira Rubin, and I am very excited to introduce you today to Bill Reed. As a principal of Regenesis, a regenerative development and design living systems integrator and education organization, Bill is a founding U.S. Green Building Council board member, co-founder of the LEED Green Building Rating System, and co-author of the seminal work, Integrative Design Guide to Green Building. One of the thinkers in this field, Bill has consulted on over 200 green commissions for buildings and city master plans, and is a keynote speaker as well as a guest lecturer to universities throughout Europe, North America, and Oceania, including Harvard, MIT, Princeton, and UPenn. And Bill, I'm so delighted to have you with us. Before we get started, now that we've teased everyone, before we get started with the interview, I want to give a shout out to several of our sponsors. These are our newest sponsors who are helping to support Sustainability Now. Steve Churchill of the Urban Worm Company, Brian Hicks of Ground Steam, and Valerie Danzy. We so appreciate your support and the support of all those who are assisting us financially through Patreon, which you can find on Patreon, patreon.com/sustainability now. You guys are helping to keep the lights on, and we so appreciate you, and you're carrying the torch. And so now we get to say a welcome, hello to Bill Reed. Bill, it is so wonderful to have you here with us. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Welcome.
Thank you, Mira. It's a pleasure to be here.
That's awesome. We hear a lot about regenerative farming and regenerative agriculture, and what you're doing is regenerative development. And this is a whole different, and whole is sort of a pun there, I guess, or an important use of words, but a whole new take, for me anyway, on this whole notion of regeneration. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what regenerative development is, so that we can have a broad understanding, and then we can dig in deeper.
Yeah, well, the term regeneration has been and is now being used in all sorts of fields. If you go to Wikipedia, you'll find it all over the place, whether it's medicine or philosophy. People are talking about that now, agriculture, obviously. And by development, we do not mean real estate development, although that's what we do. We mean developing the potential of all living entities to thrive. And so development is a synonym for evolution. So it's it's basically staying in the game of evolution is the ultimate aim of, or if you will, mode of what it means to be sustainable. And regeneration is about working with living systems on their own terms, not assuming that we know the answer and know how to fix things by adding photovoltaic panels or bicycle racks or permeable paving or a green roof, or all these, very important technologies. But those technologies in and of themselves do not add up to being, to sustaining our lives on this planet. And in order to sustain our lives on this planet requires us to sustain the lives of all the other species that collaborate to create our clean air and clean water and soil and the nutrients that all species need to stay alive. So it's this incredible network of reciprocity, a wild dance of reciprocity between all life. And that's what regenerative development means. And so regenerative agriculture or regenerative medicine depends on that depth of holistic understanding. And if it's only seen as applied to soil or farming or growing a new limb on a body, it's kind of missing the point. Now, what does it take to do that? And what it takes to do that is a whole new worldview, or a different worldview. It's not new, it's been around for millennia, but we've forgotten about it in the reductionist era of Neoplatonic thinking. Ever since Aristotle made that move to separate humans and nature, we've been on a downward slope in Western society. And it's time for us to actually relearn from indigenous peoples what it means to be indigenous, of this place, integrally involved. So regenerative development can be done in any field: accounting, law, maybe stretching that point, finance, agriculture. But where we take it is where not that many people are working is how do we actually use shelter, the development of shelter, as integral to the development of being one with life again, instead of occupying life. How do we inhabit the world instead of occupying it is the operative question.
So it's really interesting to me because you and I have had multiple conversations, and I have to confess that it's taken me a bit to wrap my head around what this notion of regenerative development is. And I'm just going to try and cliff note things for folks a little bit. And please correct me if I'm misunderstanding, but what I've gleaned from our conversations is that regenerative development, regenerative design is talking about, first of all, the integration of wholes, and wholes can go from the microcosm of just myself to myself in a family, and myself in a community, myself in a community, which is in a city, which is in a country, which is in a geographic area, which is in any case, what we're looking at is the integration of all different dimensions of being and see, now I'm getting into the weeds again. This is,
well, you can't, it's hard.
it's a
hard
really
not to.
hard thing to
Listen, life is complex, and what we've done is dumbed it down so much that we are destroying ourselves because of it. So get over it, right? We have to actually get our heads around it and stop trying to make elevator conversations out of this work. And I'm not accusing you,
Right.
but we all do that, right? Oh, I just want to just make it simple for me. Yeah, we can try. And I know it's not simple, but yet it really is. It's just, it takes the time to process it in a new way. And then you find out it is really simple, but it's so simple, we have a hard time grasping it.
Here's what I think. The thing where it started making sense to me, now that I've completely confused everyone further, is when you used a couple examples. So there was the example of the co-op in Brattleboro, Vermont. Was it Brattleboro?
Yeah.
I would love it if you would tell that story, because I think it'll give folks an understanding of what this actually is.
Sure, I think that's useful. We were hired to look at a LEED Gold grocery store. And the one question that I asked the client is, do you want LEED or do you want sustainability? That was kind of a trick question. And she said, well, we want both, which was a perfect answer, because there's a lot right about getting a certificate, because you have to jump so high and you're validating that, but the building itself is not sustainable. Like what we're doing with sustainability is sustaining life. So let's look at life. And so the next question we asked ourselves, once she answered that, is, well, what system of life does a grocery store engage in? And it engages in food. That's pretty basic. We all need that nourishment, nutrition to sustain ourselves, and then we have to sustain the soil to sustain that production. So where does our food come from in the grocery store? And so the question was, well, what happens if there's a truckers' strike? When they said, well, we're out of business in 3 days. And what happens if Whole Foods comes into town? Well, we're probably out of business in a year because we can't compete with that kind of organization. And the question that we were addressing fundamentally is, where do we get our food? And the average bite of food in the United States travels 3,600 miles. So the first meeting that we had with the executive committee, we walked through the grocery store, and the first bin that we came to in the produce section, I'm probably making this a little over dramatic, but was the apple bin. And the apples were from New Zealand. Well, there we go. And there were strawberries from California and blueberries from Chile. So you can see that this is where this incredible energy profile comes from. And no matter what we would do to the refrigeration cases and the light bulbs in the grocery store to make it energy efficient, it pales in comparison to the energy to transport the food that far. So there's a fundamental question: what do we need to engage in? What are the systems we need to engage in to, at the simplest level, reduce our carbon footprint? So the logical answer is, how do we reduce our carbon footprint? How do we avoid a trucker strike putting us out of business? How do we avoid competing with Whole Foods? And that is, all food should be local. So then we looked at, well, where are the farms? And the farms used to be all over the place in New England, very, very few remaining. And there are very few remaining because, number one, the small farmer can't compete anymore with agribusiness. The soil has been depleted because of bad farming practices and bad forestry practices over 300 years of European conquest existence in New England, 400 years. So this grocery store was the first thing we need to do, is bring the food cycle back home, and what's necessary for us to do that. Well, the best soil we found in Brattleboro was in downtown Brattleboro, because all the soil outside of it had been destroyed. And of course, everybody said, well, we built in downtown Brattleboro. No, you haven't. You've only built over 35% of the land. It's not either or. And where did most towns feed themselves in World War II? Backyard victory gardens. Why don't we do that here? Well, that's an interesting idea. So pretty quickly, we assembled a bunch of thinking together with the executive committee. This grocery store is actually going to be an agricultural and soil extension service to teach people how to grow their own food again. And a cannery where you could can the food, and a daycare center to take care of the kids when the adults were doing this, and an abattoir for hunters to dress their meat because it's a hunting area, a credit union to reestablish farms, and a forestry service extension to begin to work on the restoration of the soil health in the surrounding area. Oh, and by the way, a grocery store. And so all of that program came out of this thinking, which actually took literally about 5 days. It was not very complex to think through this through. It was systemic. What system are we nested in? What is the system of life that supports us? And what can we do to engage that system of life? And in the terms of the grocery store in Brattleboro, it was perfect, because Brattleboro is actually a food-centered town. They have a parade every year. They used to, called the March of the Heifers. Thousands of people come and they march the cows down the road. And so it's a place that's intimately engaged in nutrition and in the food cycle. So it was a logical extension of the essence of Brattleboro to work that way. So the executive committee was so excited, they rushed us to present to the board, and we were not ready. And we also didn't have our act together enough to make a good presentation. So we did that, and one of the board members said, "What is this bullshit? All we want is a grocery store." And we were fired that night. And they call it the double train wreck meeting. It was a terrible meeting. So we learned something. I think we knew it anyway, but it was reinforced, is that this isn't changing the way we be in the world, is not just producing technology. it's producing a new relationship. It's developing regenerative development. It's developing a new relationship with each other and the system that we're part of. So we wrote a long report, realizing we had to cover ourselves and justify something of our fee. And so the board and the members of the co-op read that report. Probably took about a year, almost to the day. And I got a call from the board president. He said, Bill, I want to apologize to you. This is the best thing that's ever happened to us. We have developed a 100-year ends policy to begin to incorporate this thinking into our work. So that truly, despite our ineptitude, became a regenerative project, because the building, they built a building, they built a legal building. As the board president said, the building didn't matter. What mattered is the system that we're part of. And what was cool, not only were they working on that system immediately around Brattleboro, that they began to work with other co-ops in the New England region and help coach them in thinking this way. Now that is an example of dropping a little pebble in the pond and the ripples go out. That's the power of regeneration, is the ability to create massive change through what we call a nodal intervention, through an acupuncture point. But that acupuncture point has to be resonant with that client in that particular situation. And that's the work of this, that's the nature of this work, is finding out the resonance and helping people fall in love with life again and what they can do about it to carry forward. It's not just fixing it with your technology and consulting and telling people what to do. It's actually engaging the people in that place so they're actually taking care of their place. And that's how we save the planet, place by place. All right, that's my story.
That's an amazing story. And just to be able to shorthand it maybe a little more effectively than I did before, it's kind of the difference between going to a holistic health practitioner who's looking at why you're having liver issues versus going to the surgeon who's gonna do surgery and address the liver without looking at the entire system. And what you do is you look at the system in a way that we have been conditioned out of through our reductionist problem-minded thinking, right? You said we don't look at problems.
Right. We don't look at problems, we look at potential. And when you work with potential, the problems dissolve, they actually disappear. Because if you're looking forward at what we can create together, you don't need to solve the fragmented problems anymore. In fact, you can't solve fragmented problems, because when you solve one problem, 3 or 4 others pop up. Or if you think you're solving one problem, but basically you're ignoring the system that problem is born from. So it really requires taking a step back. And how do you work with systems that are that complex? This requires working with the patterns or the essence of that system, because that's how we learn anything, is through patterns.
So you told me another story that is kind of mind-blowing. Like it's very much a huge shift of paradigm to have somebody come in when you're wanting to make a grocery store and have that team talking about creating farms in the gardens of the occupants of the town or the residents. That's crazy. I mean, wild, very radical shift of paradigm to be thinking on that scale. But you told me another story about New Hampshire and Vermont, and I don't remember what.
Yeah. That's kind of a fun story. We claim, and we're not the only ones that are talking about this, other practitioners in holistic thinking talk about the same thing. You always start with geology. That's literally the foundation of our lives. And how did the rocks get formed? How did your land get formed? How did the soil get formed? How did the habitat get formed? Because you can't escape that. Even if you think you're above that and can pave it over, it's still there, and those forces are still there. And this became apparent one time. We just to give a little foreshadowing, I used to live in Vermont, and we would be at a restaurant, for instance, and we couldn't get home at night because the leaf peepers came up from New York and New Jersey and Connecticut to look at the colors, and it was literally bumper to bumper traffic, and you were stuck maybe for a couple hours.
Wow.
You complained into your beer. Why did they go to New Hampshire? Why did they come to Vermont? Well, somebody said, well, the leaves are slightly, there's a different color. Colors in New Hampshire. Oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. And Yeah, the politics is different in New Hampshire. The farming's different in New Hampshire, and the mountains are different in New Hampshire. Glug, glug, glug. Go back to whatever you're talking about. But that conversation remained with me. Yeah, 30 miles away over the Connecticut River, it's an entirely different place. What's that about? So we were working on a project in Boston, and when we work with Nest, we work with the largest system we can imagine because it's informing us. New England is effectively one big ecoregion. So how did New England get formed? Well, it turns out 2.5 billion years ago when Pangaea, the monocontinent, was splitting apart, the Laurentian plate, or the North American plate, that was the proto-North America, separated from the African plate. You can't see my hands moving here, but the North African plate, and they formed the Proto-Atlantic Ocean. And I apologize to geologists who are maybe listening that I'm oversimplifying and probably bastardizing the story, but it's close enough. There was a big chunk of North Africa that broke off, and the geologists call it Avalonia. And Avalonia floated in the middle of the Proto-Atlantic for who knows how many millions of years. And it caught a wave, a magma wave, and went back to the northeast and slammed into North America. And the division line, and this is grossly misinterpreting it, but close enough, is because there are multiple other geological events. But in general, the division line between that Avalonia and the Laurentian plate is the Connecticut River. And if you will, on the east side of the Connecticut River is a granite state. Vermont, New Hampshire is known as the granite state. And Vermont is a metamorphic state, sedimentary rock, limestone, marble. The farming practices are different. The kind of personality that's able to handle that difference is differentiated because there's different folks that can handle that stuff. New Hampshire's a tough state. What's the state motto in New Hampshire? Live free or die. Now, it didn't mean that originally, but it's what's kind of interpreted now. We're independent cusses. In Vermont, I think it's united in liberty or united in freedom. So you can see these two different worldviews emerged right next door to each other. And they actually came out of the rock that formed them. And that's still reflected today. So when we work in communities, the first thing that we do is look for how this place was formed. We're working in Pittsburgh right now, for instance. Most people don't know that there was a fourth river in Pittsburgh that formed the flat area that became the cultural center of Pittsburgh. All around the rivers, the Monongahela, the Allegheny, and the Ohio, is the industry and the business. Very difficult living, and dirty, and at the time, steel making, coal, and coke making. Up above is where the universities were established, the museums, the libraries, the zoo, the Pips Conservatory. We call it euphemistically the living room of Pittsburgh. And it was formed by a fourth river that created that flat area of Pittsburgh. And that energy and that flat area is what allowed Pittsburgh to be the dynamic city that it is. It punches significantly above its weight because it allows for that diversity of quality of life to exist in one place. But it was keying into that river that actually had us take a step back, that fourth river, that basically said, oh yeah, what happens with a river? It lays down sediment, it lays down places for settlement. And that is a key towards what is kind of missing in Pittsburgh now, is that united quality of life that happened on that flat area. So how do we actually rebirth that? So that's just a vague idea that how geology still is affecting us today, and that we need to pay attention to it, because those are difficult forces to change. It's better to surf those. I hope that made some sense.
So I find this endlessly fascinating, because you can keep going larger and larger and larger, and then coming back to whatever the issue is at hand. So when we look, for instance, at the co-op, they just wanted a grocery store, and you created a whole new cosmology almost for their space. And so what I want to do is bring it back to how do we go from the micro to the macro to the micro and actually shift it, and what are the advantages? Because you've
Let me give you the broader framing of this and why this is so important. Is that first of all, what you suggested, that we are wholes. There are living wholes. Well, what's a whole? Not H-O-L-E, W-H-O-L-E. A whole is anything that is singular, meaning identifiable. A cell is a whole. Your body is a whole. Vital, it's alive, singular, alive, and evolving. Now that makes a living whole. All right, so far so good. I think that most people wouldn't argue with that. What's the utility of that? Well, wholes are nested, because the question is, well, which whole do I work with? The cell, the body, my family, the neighborhood, all of them. Now, but to make that practical, you need at least 3, because 2, you basically are in a kind of complementary or contrasting relationship, but 3 implies a direction. And so every whole has to add value to the next whole. That whole needs to add value to the next whole. And that whole also receives value from that larger whole, receives value. So without a conscious understanding of the value that is being added from whole to whole, we will mess things up.
And you also indicated a reciprocity. It has to go.
Well, yeah, it's back and forth. So what do we receive? What do we add? And that dance of reciprocity between wholes is what we need to be paying attention to. And those are typically, well, they're both visible and invisible, but the invisible patterns, the pattern that you and I have right now, Mira, we're going back and forth and, trying to understand something. That dynamic, we're not arguing each other, although some people could take offense and say, well, boy, you're not agreeing, and you're not, well, that's a relationship that is built on respect. So by the respect that we have for one another, we are adding value to this conversation. If I took a defensive position or an antagonistic position, it would not be value adding. It would be actually defensive building, right? And there would not be value added to that. And we would actually be de-energized and deflated as a result. So we wouldn't be encouraging life in this case. And maybe stretching this analogy, but it's the patterns of our existence that actually indicate the value that's being served.
So I want to bring it back, because you have said to me, I'm a pragmatist. And so I want to bring it back to how this approach is actually something that saves time, saves money, creates a more beneficial result. I mean, I think we're getting an idea of how it's creating a more beneficial result. And people that are creating projects are concerned with the timeline. They are concerned with the bottom line. And I'd like to have you address that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And on an average, we save about 18 months in site plan approval time on our projects. That is worth a lot of money to a developer. And so most developers say, well, I can't afford the time that you spend to do this work, which is typically 2 to 3 months. Well, that's going to cost money. Almost I would say every project we've worked on, I'm sure there's got to be an exception there, we sometimes start later, but we finish way ahead of the competition. And the reason is because we are in a relationship with a community of people that we are working within. Because the first thing that we do is we don't propose a project and say, look, isn't this the most beautiful project you've ever seen because I designed it? I mean, that's really what you're saying. Well, that's an ego turnoff, right? To people, well, who are you to say it's the most beautiful project? It's in my community. We might have some say in that. And so when we work with developers and work in communities, is we don't propose any design. All we propose is there's property here that we are taking responsibility for and stewarding. We do have to make a profit. That's the one thing that, and nature works on a profit basis. There's nothing wrong with a profit. The idea, though, is that profit needs to be in service. So how can this project, as long as the developer can be in service to the community, what is the nature of use that would be best for this project and for the community and for the developer? Because we also hold that nature harmonizes, it doesn't compromise. So how do we actually harmonize and reconcile these forces? Compromise, we concede, we give up, and both sides lose. How do we actually create a win-win, if you will? So we do this by actually finding out what is at the core of what people really care about and need. And most of us don't take the time to think that way. We react, well, I don't like that, or I don't want that, or I've seen bad projects, so this one's going to be bad too. We make all sorts of assumptions instead of exploring with mutual respect the potential for this development. And so that basically happens because we first start by looking at the health and what the system needs and how we can add value to that system with this project. That dialogue is what saves, it's what allows people not only to be in new relationship with each other and new relationship with the developer, but a new relationship with the place they live. Because most of us are only solving problems. We're not working with the system. So we're helping the community dance with all those forces at the same time, which is not really complicated. It's just getting everything on the table and giving space for it to be explored.
It's a radically new paradigm. And as you said earlier, it is not founded in the reductionism that we've been conditioned to. Right. So you had given me an example. A lot of the situations where you're called in is when there are conflicts, or if a developer is encountering challenges with a community and they can't get their project forwarded, and you guys are brought in to come in and make your magic. And I'd love it if you'd share one of those stories, because I think here's why I'm having you do stories, because we can talk around and around and around, but the stories are giving us examples of this work in action.
Sure. So we often get hired because I present stories, and people say, "Oh, I want that." And one of the things, but then I also frame it. We talked about frameworks. This idea of the law of three. All life can be seen as an activating force and a receiving force or a restraining force, and that's dualism. Yes, no. This is why we have lawyers. We fight over winning one side or the other, and then we compromise. Both sides lose. Well, nature generally doesn't compromise. Nature harmonizes. The willow tree does not argue with the oak tree about exchanging nutrients, and because they know they're in it together. And we have a tendency to
want to take a minute to put a pin in that.
Sure.
Because I don't want it to get swept into the rest of the conversation, because that in and of itself is the foundational shift of paradigm that will bring us into a transformed future. And that is that nature doesn't compromise, nature harmonizes. We have been conditioned to believe that a lose-lose situation is the best that we can achieve. And this is a radical transformation from that.
Yes, if our politicians could actually work that way and be in conversation rather than in war, we would have an incredibly effective democracy.
It would be a very different world all the way around.
It would be. It's the most, that framework is the significant framework on this planet that the planet's missing. The mystic Gurdjieff said that we are third force blind in our world, meaning we live in this world of duality. We actually don't think about that third opportunity, that there's actually a third way to go.
Yes.
If we take the time.
Yes.
So we often get hired by developers saying, wow, if you can harmonize all the conflict in my life, that would be great. And so we get hired. So we were hired by a very large corporation in Chile, doing a massive project, about 1.5 million square feet, as a gift to the city. They were worked out of, and there were 25 activist groups all fighting against this developer, and they all called the developer the enemy, in quotation marks. So it was war from the very beginning. I said, listen, we don't understand how you do your work. We don't even believe that you can do your work, but this is a gigantic project. It's worth a couple of months of your time. Are you game to show us what you can do? Well, sure, why not? So first visit, we found, introduced to a local architect anthropologist who was wonderful and became an on the ground partner with us, which is really essential when you're working that far away. And two of us went down and we spent the first 3 weeks there engaged in conversation with the activist groups and they said, why should we trust you? A couple of gringos from the States, for one thing.
Working for the enemy.
Yeah, working for the enemy. What? And they said, and we said, basically, we're here because we are planners by nature, and we want to heal the world we want to heal the relationships with each other and the natural systems that support us. Who hires us almost doesn't matter. We grant you that there's a bit of bias, and we are happy to acknowledge that and be called on it. But I can tell you that when you drive into your city in the first 5 minutes, you know that this is a dying city. And they said, oh yeah, okay, so let's work on that, because that's the opportunity here. This developer does not want to invest in a dying city. It's in their interest that this city be healthy, and it's in your interest that this city be healthy. You're focused on fighting against a perceived problem of a development that you think is somehow going to fix the city. It won't. Whatever you do to this development won't fix the city. We actually have to take a big step back and work together in what the potential of this city can be, not the little bitty problems. And the development is just one little bitty problem. You have mobility problems, you have beach erosion problems, you have habitat connectivity problems, you have social justice problems. I mean, you're losing business, you're losing the young people, you're losing the tourists, which is the big thing. And this is a big tourist town. Oh yeah, all those are true. So why don't we work on those together and integrate ourselves along with the developer? So what we propose is that the developer is an equal stakeholder, no more important or less important than any other activist group. And we created an image of all of us being stakeholders in service of this larger system. Well, that took 3 weeks, and we had 17 or 18 of those activist groups we had time to meet with. And every one of them, except one guy in one activist group, said, yeah, that's worth doing. So within a 3-week period, we flipped the animosity to being co-creative. And then we were off to the races. And it took, and then it's a practice, Mira, because life is a practice. You can't wave a magic wand and say, oh, I made it sustainable, or we built this green building and all of a sudden we're a sustainable culture. Exercise is a practice, learning a language is a practice, meditation is a practice, anything's a practice that is worth doing. And why we think sustainability happens because we have a building is kind of perplexing to me. So how do we build a practice of developing the capability to sustain our lives or regenerate our lives? Because by the way, you can't have sustainability without regeneration. Doesn't make sense. So we practiced once every 6 weeks. We would have a meeting with a core group in the community so they could actually begin to see how to effectively work together. We assembled, I think, professors from, now I'm making this number up, I think there were 11 universities in this Valparaiso, Viña del Mar area. And I think we assembled professors from 5 or 6 of these universities to work together to work on how the brownfield, the pollution on the site was going to be remediated, because they didn't believe us, they didn't believe the bureaucracy, but they would believe the professors in their own town. But that took almost a year to herd those cats of professors. But we did, they did, and they worked, and it was magical. And basically they got, the first time in Chile, got this brownfield remediation approved. Yeah. So it is working. It is a practice, and it continually needs, it goes through fits and starts. But what's cool about this is that we left that project with the impulse to keep practicing. And that's the most important thing. And I got a call from literally the CEO. I hadn't talked to him in 4 years, just 2 weeks ago. who just wanted to check in, which I thought was quite delightful and give me kind of an accounting of what was going on. So that indicates that this is an ongoing.
And what kind of results, you said over 4 years, what kind of results are happening now in the city?
Oh, the punchline, the fun punchline is the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce of the construction and design industry, which is very big there, said, we don't need to talk to a couple of gringos. We know how it works and don't waste our time. Well, he called up our client after 10 months, after these meetings have been going on. And he said, Ricardo, I don't know what you guys are doing, but count us in. This is the first time the city's been able to dream in 30 years.
Wow.
And they donated a few $1 million to begin the restoration of the estuary that had nothing to do with the project, but had everything to do with the city. The mayor did not want to talk with us because we were a political threat. And she saw, oh, this is actually a good thing. And she basically said, yeah, it's time to play. So it takes time to build that kind of those relationships and that confidence. And that's what I mean by the practice, that it's ongoing, it's developmental, it's evolutionary, and it goes on forever. There's no end to that. That's the deliverable.
Regeneration is an ongoing process.
Well, listen, it's an ongoing process in your family. Think of it at any scale. If I argue with my spouse, and I may have done something pretty stupid. Usually it is me being stupid about something. And okay, I guess that was kind of stupid. I need to change my tune. I'm sorry. I get what I did. I've regenerated that relationship.
Yeah.
So that's what we mean by regeneration.
So what I want to take a look at is that this is very much driven by a different level of beingness. And
Yes.
This is at risk of getting into the woo-woo realm, which is one of my favorite places to be. But
Gotta go there.
Pardon me?
Gotta go there.
Yeah. So here's the thing is when we establish sustainability now, we define the pillars: food, energy, housing, waste, water, health, economics, and consciousness, with consciousness being key, because until we change our foundation of beingness, our relationship to ourselves, each other, and the world and nature, then nothing's going to change. Like you said, the building isn't going to create sustainability or regeneration.
Right.
So I would love it if you would take a minute or two to address the beingness aspect of the work you do.
Well, that's the question, because this work is about the process of being and becoming. And that's, by the way, speaking of Chile, the Chilean biologist, philosopher Humberto Maturana, and his partner, I'm drawing a blank on his name. I'm going to paraphrase, I think Aeneas Nin paraphrased it, but life is the process of becoming. If we're working with life, we ought to know what life is. And of course, philosophers have been trying to answer that question for thousands of years, but that's the best answer I've ever heard. Life is the process of becoming. Evolutionary, if nothing else. Can't argue with that. Pretty foundational. So how do we participate? What we want to do in our culture is build things that don't change. Static. We want to be static, because who wants to be bothered?
We want predictability and control.
That's right, we do. And that's the thing you never have. So we want it, we can't have it. And yet we keep, and that's one of the problems, one of the reasons we're so miserable is we keep worrying about all the changes that keep going on. Join the club. That's, start surf emergence is what I like to say. And what happens, here's the seeming paradox, is that if we work with nature on her own terms, we will have stability, but it will be dynamic stability. And the analogy, I think the simplest analogy is looking at a prairie. That a prairie, the more diverse the species are in a prairie, the more that it can handle buffalo stampedes, insect infestation, fire, drought, monocultures. Well, not monocultures, but they can recover. As long as there's diversity there, those different niches will be filled depending on the perturbations that the system gives to it and reestablish itself very quickly. If we make monocultures, if you destroy that monoculture, the system is destroyed, and then you're really in trouble. And of course, that's what we've done all across the planet. So this is why I keep emphasizing the idea of the test is, do you have a diversity of species, ever increasing diversity of species, and diversity of relationships between those species. It's just not diversity, they've got to be in relationship, and the opportunity to be in relationship. Then you have stability. And by the way, we're failing on almost all counts in that arena. So this is why we have to be paying attention to the life that we live within, and how do we actually create diversity, not stomp on it.
And one of the things that arose in our conversation was the courage that it takes to be exploring these unknown spaces. And I'd like you to address that, if you would.
Yeah, well, it's difficult. This is not a market that people are clamoring to have served. My life has been pretty much finding and identifying those few people who are ready to say, yeah, it's time to think differently. It's time to be differently. And it's not easy. And yet somebody's got to do it. And there are beginning to be enough of us out there from all different perspectives, not just who are looking at what does it really take to participate with life on its own terms. This isn't for people. I made a decision when I was 5 years old not to have children, and
wow,
yeah,
rather early to make that kind of choice.
It's a weird, yeah. I was a weird kid, I suppose, but that has served me well because I haven't had to worry so much about putting kids through college. And I've been able to actually serve the mission of this work. And I knew I wanted to be a planner when I was in 8th grade, because I knew, and I wanted to be an architect before that. And I realized to be an architect, I wanted to create beautiful buildings. And I realized, well, if the community around the building is not healthy, then what good is the beautiful building? So I realized, I got to be a planner, an urban planner, a community planner. I thought, if the ecosystem is not healthy around that community, then what good is the functioning community? It's not going to function. So I had to realize, I got to expand that. It took me, I went to college to be an architect and a planner, and I couldn't handle the planning school because it made no sense to me, because it didn't address those core issues. So I didn't know what I was missing. I knew I was missing something, but I didn't know how to put it together. It wasn't until the sustainability movement came along, I said, that's what I was missing. So then I would say since the late 80s, I've been able to make sense of this work. And I can only say in the last 20 years that I could say that I'm really an effective planner, meaning working on how do we actually work with the system that we're part of. Not telling the system what to do, but how do we work with the energies that are present on their own terms.
So what you're looking at is curiosity and responsiveness, rather than coming in with a determination that you're trying to impose. You're dancing with the condition. Is that?
Yeah, I had one CEO say to me, Bill, you're always changing the agenda, or you're changing the course. Are you in control? I said, of course not.
Right, and he freaked out and got alarmed.
I said, are you in control? I said, why did you hire me if you were in control? So none of us are in control. And now the question is how do we work with the energies that are present? Because that's what, and we can flip if, the energies can be negative too, but they're negative for a reason. Well, let's find that out. Let's work with those, because that's where the power comes from.
Yeah. Bill, I could talk with you on and on and on. I want to conclude this for now, or at least start wrapping it up with something very, very hopeful you had expressed to me, and that was about a tipping point.
Oh, oh, my little story that I tell myself. Yeah, well, it's pretty. I think it has some validity. We can act on it. Well, we have always maintained that place is the largest manageable unit, if you will, in the planet. That we can actually understand the place we live. We can't understand the planet. And then Eleanor Ostrom came along and kind of said the same thing. She won, I think, the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 for her work in common pool resource. And the premise is, and
Who is that? Who is that again?
Eleanor Ostrom,
Okay.
and Ostrom, and she basically said, Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons basically said that we will abuse and destroy the planet because we think that everything is for free, right? The ocean is for free, and the air is for free, and the water is for free, until we, of course, everybody abuses it, and then we destroy the goose that laid the golden egg. But she said, around the world, that place is the system that people pay attention to. They pay attention to the feedback from that system. Oh, we're screwing it up. Maybe we need to do something about it. And so I like to think we can't save the planet. It's too big and too abstract, but we can save our places. And so saving the planet, in quotation marks, basically means saving the world place by place. And then I did 5 minutes of research. I went to Wikipedia and I said, well, how many cities are there on the planet? Well, apparently there are 4,037 cities, if you believe Wikipedia, larger than 100,000 people. It's not that many. And typically in marketing, you look at a 1 to 10% tipping point, but 3.5% is kind of this average tipping point, the 100th monkey, which if you get 3.5% of anything, you got the whole market, or a massive part of it. So 3.5% of 4,037 is 141 cities. So folks, we got 141 cities to go for to actually, can we create a regenerative relationship, an indigenous relationship in those places we live? I don't think that's too difficult, and I think the world would rapidly get back into shape. Now, will we do that? I don't know. I'm not very sanguine about that, but it's manageable. And so that's what I hold as my motivating image.
It's doable.
Yeah.
It feels doable.
Yep.
So I so appreciate that. Before we wrap up, I do want to ask you if you have any resources to recommend. I'm certain you must, but some that we can point people to, books or movies or whatever.
Well, specifically our practice, I do recommend, it's a fairly deep dive, is the book Regenerative Development and Design. And then if you want to go deep in 2 different ways, I recommend Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta, who's a doctoral PhD guy and an Australian Aborigine. And he's encapsulated indigenous thinking and the power and sophistication of that better than any writer I've seen. If you want from Western tradition, I recommend reading David Bohm, the quantum physicist's book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. That's kind of a deep dive. You don't need to read the formulas. There's a lot of good text. And then the last one is I'm reading right now because I think it actually offers, it shows that our ancestors were darn sophisticated and we have really dumbed things down, is The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber, who just passed away, an anthropologist. It's really one of the most elegant and reframing of the brilliance, because you know what, we think we're so sophisticated. We are less sophisticated than people from thousands of years ago, and he demonstrates that. And the sophisticated flexibility in governance, which based on situation and needs at the time. They didn't just hold one size fits all, an authoritarian. Basically, it's very flat, very authoritarian, depending on the need. Anyway, those books I would highly recommend.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we're going to make sure to have links for all of those books on our website. And do you have a website? Like, can you direct us to the Regenesis website or?
Yeah, it's regenesisgroup.com.
And that's spelled Regenesis. Will you spell it for us?
Yeah, Regenesis, like Genesis in the Bible, regenesisgroup.com.
Beautiful. Bill, thank you so much. And I want to say thank you to all of you who are listening, who share our enthusiasm and our hope and our website and our and our content. And I want to remind you that you can help keep the lights on by going to patreon.com/sustainability now. And we so appreciate you carrying the torch. And so that's it for today. Live your best life, love the world around you, and together we can save the world.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now, solutions to shape a world that works. Visit sustainabilitynow.global for resources related to today's program. And be sure to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.